Good morning from Whidbey Island. Thanks for having me participate today, and here's hoping that we'll be able to do these sort of things in person in the very near future. The topic that I would like to deal with briefly today is the collapse of communism in the Soviet Union and Albania. There are many parallels that can be drawn between the collapse of communism in the Soviet Union and Albania, but I'd like to focus on one of the major differences, the role of elite dissent in both instances. Without delving into extensive detail, I believe it's safe to say that post-Stalin Soviet dissidents like Solzhenitsyn, Sakharov, Pasternak, Kamenetsky, and we could of course add dozens of more names, played an important role in the collapse of the Soviet Union. In contrast, Fatis Labonia, a writer and political commentator in Tirana, has said, quote, "In Albania, dissidents did not exist. There is a difference between a dissident and a victim of the regime. A dissident is someone who has the possibility to enlighten other people, to express his opinions, maybe go to prison, but to inspire others and to make a choice. While in Albania, we were just victims, which means we did not inspire others, but were instead people whose experience instilled fear in others." Mr. Labonia, who, as we know, spent many years in Enver Hoxha's prisons, is uniquely positioned to make a judgment of this sort. And so the question remains, why was effective dissent so limited and ineffective? Enver Hoxha, who ruled Albania from 1944 until his death in 1985, certainly experienced considerable early opposition and dissent from within his own movement. And there were more than a few occasions when his political and physical survival was very much in doubt. The strength of early opposition to his regime and to him personally does much to explain the brutal repression which even a vague hint of divergence from his prescribed line would later engender. Following the war, Albania became a virtual satellite of Yugoslavia, which had played an important role in the success of the communist resistance during the war. This status created various challenges for Hoxha from both the Yugoslavs and from within his own party. While Hoxha recognized Tito's designs on Albanian independence, he did not initially feel strong enough to resist them. As a result, he was challenged by nationalist elements within his party who were anti-Yugoslav. At the same time, the much more powerful, staunchly pro-Yugoslav elements, led by the brutal and ambitious Minister of the Interior, Koji Zodza, accused him of lack of diligence in tying Tirana closer to Beograd. In early 1948, Hoxha's position weakened to the extent that he was forced to admit errors in policy. He would certainly have ended up in front of one of Zodza's firing squads had it not been for the Yugoslav-Soviet break. Hoxha staunchly supported Stalin in this dispute. He also took the opportunity to arrest and shoot Zodza and many of his followers, in the process purging fully a quarter of the members of the party. Hoxha had survived what was likely the most serious threat to his leadership, and Albania moved from being a sub-satellite of the Yugoslavs and became a full satellite of the Soviets. By the mid-50s, Hoxha's regime was considered the most Stalinist regime in Eastern Europe, and Hoxha himself was therefore again seriously jeopardized by the process of de-Stalinization which the communist bloc endured. The death of Stalin in 1953 resulted in a certain liberalization in both foreign and domestic policy throughout much of the socialist world, accompanied by a denunciation of the excesses of Stalin. The Soviet Union, under Nikita Khrushchev, initiated a rapprochement with Yugoslavia, and both the Soviets and the Yugoslavs encouraged Hoxha to rehabilitate Zodza. Hoxha clearly saw the danger. He, like Stalin, had by this point instituted a cult of the personality based upon a reign of terror. In defending Stalin and his policies, he was defending himself. and he did so with increased brutality. But Hoxha again survived what was, I would suggest, the last important attempt by internal forces to remove him. As in 1948, Hoxha was again saved by events beyond his control. In this case, the invasion of Hungary by Soviet and Warsaw Pact forces in order to crush a move towards liberalization allowed him to move against those in the party who hoped to follow Khrushchev's de-Stalinization example. He admitted that some mistakes had been made, but blamed imperialist agents who just happened to be all of those in the party whom he suspected of disloyalty. These people were quickly removed, many of them liquidated and replaced by more reliable communists, usually the relatives of his closest supporters. The party leadership, which was increasingly bound together by common complicity in murderous purges, had become Hoxha's clan. He had essentially adapted local conditions to Stalinism. In 1960, in the midst of the Albanian Soviet break, he again felt challenged by pro-Soviet cadres within the party who objected to his turn towards China. The economic hardship caused by the loss of Soviet credits encouraged Hoxha to increase his repression through the institution of the so-called ideological and cultural revolution. The principal aim of this wrenching shakeup was again to eliminate potential alternative centers of power to the party and to Hoxha himself. Unlike the Chinese version, the Albanian cultural revolution was meant to further centralize power. The small intelligentsia was particularly targeted. Ramazalia, Hoxha's chief ideologue and his eventual successor, laid down the line that the chief function of literature and art was to provide young people with the necessary immunity against the poisons of both bourgeois and revisionist ideologies. This was accompanied by an attack on religion, bureaucracy, and the traditional structure of the army. Those who questioned these changes, included members of the military and the economic establishment, were purged. The Cultural Revolution, which is, with its main phase between 1966 and 1969, exhausted the party and the country as a whole. While Hoxha's excesses did not and could not result in a widespread organized dissident movement, they did result in increasing restlessness among young people and intellectuals. For the youth, who had no wartime experience and for whom the slogans about the partisan struggle were becoming increasingly irrelevant, the issues included hair length, popular music, and access to Western literature. The intellectuals craved at least a slight shift away from the straitjacket of socialist realism. Similar to Stalin's second five-year plan following the horrors of collectivization, and meant as something of a correction, from 1969 to 1972, Hoxha flirted with limited cultural and economic reform. Again, some questioned this initiative, this time conservatives within the party who feared the effect of even limited relaxation. While the actual changes were certainly imperceivable to all but the most careful observers, Hoxha eventually saw them as another threat and quickly reversed course. Hoxha struck again and buried the first signs of an independent post-war culture in Albania. Officials of the Writers' Union and Albania's radio and television services were sacked, and the official youth movement was overhauled to enhance party control. Literature returned to the only acceptable theme, which was the anti-fascist struggle during World War II. As the Chinese connection began to fade, due to what Hoxha termed a Chinese slide into revisionism, Albania receded into a state of siege, a mentality basically fearing, quote, coordinated aggressive activity by Greek monarch fascists, Italian neo-fascists, Yugoslav and Soviet revisionists, all supported by US and British imperialists. So as we have seen, There was a good deal of sporadic party opposition to Hoxha and his policies, at least until the 60s, but little real dissent beyond that period. Albania diverges from the Soviet Union and the rest of the communist bloc in this regard, in part because of the nature of Hoxha, as well as the security apparatus which underpinned his regime, and by the way Hoxha employed it. It can be argued that next to Stalin, Hoxha was the strongest of the communist strongmen in Europe who built an inflexible totalitarian structure. While some Balkan dictatorships seemed to mellow with age, Hoxha became more extreme, building a regime based on labor camps, prison camps, arbitrary arrests, beatings, and government-sanctioned murder. The regime rested in large part on the extensive security apparatus with an accompanying army of informants. Hoxha and his police were allowed into virtually every living room in the country. Hoxha's security service was one of the most comprehensive in Eastern Europe. The Sigurimi, the most feared component, ran an extensive prison and work camp system in which conditions were, of course, appalling. Inmates were routinely tortured and starved of decent food and medical care. Further, the state ran an internal exile system where tens of thousands convicted of lesser political offenses were forced to relocate to remote villages where they were treated as pariah by local peasantry. A person was rarely condemned to exile alone. Like under Stalin in the Soviet Union, his or her entire family, and often friends and supporters, would also be sent away. Many were condemned with the help of their own children, who were considered a primary means of government surveillance. At school, children were encouraged to spy on family members and report all anti-government activity to the authorities. Children were rewarded for such activity with better grades. Albanians, unable to trust their own children, were cowed into a fearful state of submission, conformism, and apathy, with their thoughts kept secret, paranoid, and suspicious of all around them. For the elite, party members and their children, dissent was further discouraged by what can be described as a continuous purge which Hoxha instituted, some of which has been touched on before. The Albanian party was by far the most purge-affected of all the Eastern European parties. One of Hoxha's last major purges was one of the most brutal and remains something of a mystery to this day, but helps us to understand the process. Mehmet Shehu, the prime minister, had been Hoxha's trusted right hand since the war. Shehu was the assumed successor, but Hoxha seems to have decided sometime in 1981 that he was not the one to carry on his work. In December 1981, Albanians were astonished to learn that Shehu had committed suicide in a fit of depression. In 1982, they were perhaps even more astonished to learn that Shehu had all along been a multiple agent in the pay of British, Yugoslav, American, and Soviet intelligence services. Shehu's death was followed by yet another bloody purge, this time falling principally on the military and the Sigurimi, the institutions with which Shehu was most closely associated. The process associated with the last major purge is instructive, and recent research has done much to help explain some of the issues I raise in this paper. In his article, Enver Hoxha's Last Purge, published in East European Politics, Societies, and Cultures, published this past August 2021, Idrisi of the University of Vienna examines the case of Kadri Hazibu in considerable detail. Among his conclusions is the assertion that Hoxha's comrades lived in a state of total arbitrariness and permanent fear of death. And they were, of course, forced to become complicit in order to avoid becoming victims. As soon as someone was suspected, all those present pounced with vicious brutality, while the accused practiced self-deprecating self-criticism and hysterically hurled accusations at their colleagues. I hope this doesn't sound too far-fetched, but it occurred to me that there is at least some parallel between the elite in Albania during the Hoxha years and Jews in Hitler's extermination camps. There was nothing you could do, no specific action you could take to facilitate your survival. There was no solid ground which could offer sanctuary. Hoxha's motivation at this point, since clearly his position was no longer under threat, is open to discussion. It is at least possible that he was hoping to preserve his legacy by removing strong leaders who might in some way change course. Ramaz Alia was a safe choice, without much of a personal power base, at least not as much as people like Shehu. I think certainly some more work needs to be done on this issue. It's an important component of understanding Hoxha's personality in general. Clearly, as during Stalin's time, no one was safe. Given the nature of Hoxha and his regime then, there was simply no opportunity for an organized dissident movement to materialize after the early 60s. Tolerated dissident groups like those ultimately, with those that helped overthrow the regimes in Poland, Hungary, and other East European states, simply did not exist in Albania, or at least were so small as to have little impact on events. Albanian Stalinism survived virtually intact for 37 years after the death of Stalin. Without the extensive dissent found in other communist bloc states, dissent which clearly contributed to the collapse of these regimes, what explains the demise of the Albanian regime following Hoxha's death? Certainly a minor role was played by Albania's rather anemic intelligentsia, but generally not until the late 80s and the early 90s, just prior to the collapse. The Albanian intelligentsia, I would argue, was considerably weaker than those found elsewhere in the communist bloc, in part because of Albania's level of development. The intelligentsia was almost entirely located in Tirana and had only started to become a force in society with the opening of Albania's first university in 1957. When compared to those in other Eastern European countries, it must be considered immature and certainly closely aligned with the party. Its style tended to be paternalistic and authoritarian, frequently combining intellectual mediocrity with a blind loyalty to even the most extreme elements of the Hoxhaist dogma. As we have seen, the intelligentsia became a particular target during the Cultural Revolution. For the subsequent 2 decades, writers and intellectuals faithfully carry out the party's policies of socialist realism, serving as little more than propaganda tools with which the party could control the people. The Albanian intelligentsia never fully recovered from the onslaught it experienced during the Cultural Revolution and subsequent purges. By the late 80s and the early 90s, years after Hoxha's death, some elites, like Kadare, of course, found their voice. So the intellectuals contributed, but the regime would likely have collapsed without their contribution. Hoxha's policies had led to little more than grinding poverty and geopolitical isolation. In the midst of this disaster, Albania entered the television age, which presented Albanians with a glimpse of the outside world from which the regime was protecting them. Albanian programming naturally operated under strict controls and was used for the usual purposes of political indoctrination and education. But Albanians could also watch Yugoslav, Greek, and Italian channels. This activity was discouraged, but particularly after Hoxha's death, the lure was simply too strong. Cracks in the state of siege began to appear. By the late 1980s, students were listening to rock music and growing their hair This was accompanied by the first signs of criticism in the media of the dogmatism of the party. All of this was further accompanied by increasing dissatisfaction among the workers, who suffered from an economy plagued by over-centralization, persistent, often inept interference from the center, a tremendous waste of resources, distorted prices, inefficient enterprises, widespread corruption, and constant shortages of basic goods. Alia's response to the growing crisis was woefully inadequate. He tinkered with the economy, loosened the party's grip in the cultural sector, and gradually expanded Albania's relations with other countries. His measures clearly were aimed at improving the functioning of the communist system rather than changing it. Even had this been possible, which is certainly doubtful, Alia responded far too late with far too little. In the final analysis, the regime collapsed for a myriad of reasons. Elite dissent played, in my view, only a minor role. Thank you very much. I've enjoyed discussing this further, but under these circumstances, it's of course difficult. I hope to see you all soon.